I actually appreciate having this chance to sit down and chat with you because, we haven't done a whole lot of work together yet. So it's a
Yeah,
chance to see how you think.
yeah,
So,
absolutely.
but yeah, I do want to know what you think about gaslighting. That's kind of our topic for today. And I imagine you hear that a lot I hear it a lot in my sessions. So I imagine that you do too.
Oh yeah.
And I'm kind of wondering what your definition of gaslighting is.
Oh boy.
Like, what's your working definition?
Yeah. I think that there's lots of different types of gaslighting, and I think there's a difference also between the what looks like the covert gaslighting and the overt gaslighting, because I think sometimes it is much more intentional and malicious, and other times it can be um, much more just sort of automatic response or defense, but not in a very conscious type of way. So, yeah. So I think depending on where the behavior is on that continuum, I think it can look very different.
Yeah, I think a lot of times gaslighting is, as we're trying to make sense of the world, our own world, we'll say things that come across as gaslighting. But I think, my definition would be the higher on the continuum it is where it looks more intentional. It is more about keeping the other person unsettled,
Hmm.
questioning their own gut and that kind of thing. So, I it is hard. I think there's a fine line in there. Sometimes it's hard to see, is this just someone who is immaturely externally processing their own memories or what they want, or or trying to get what they want. Like, there's still some of that's normal immaturity. But then there's that other spectrum where someone is continually doing it because it's a power and control dynamic. And
Yeah.
when it's insidious and insistent and no room for making room for the other person's opinion or perspective, that's where it gets really destructive.
Right. And I see like the kind of the more unconscious, um, like you said, emotionally immature uh, gaslighting. I see that type of gaslighting looking more like saying I just don't understand, or I just don't remember, or or sometimes even like it almost appears like flattery, like you're just so much smarter in these areas than I am. You must know, okay, that's I just don't get it. I just can't understand this stuff. um and then the more overt gaslighting is certainly much more of reality denial, and saying that no, that's not what happened, when the other person might actually have like a text message or an email that proves that it was the other
Mm-hmm.
the other way. But it also can I think take the form of uh, what do you call it when you call in experts or family
Oh,
members
case
also.
building.
Yeah, there you go, the case
Mm-hmm.
building, where it's like saying, well, I'm not the only one that thinks you're crazy, or thinks that whatever the
Mm-hmm.
argument is. It's all these other people believe it as well. You can ask this person, or you can ask our kids, they all believe that as well.
So maybe the key element for identifying the harm of it is, you know, every person's entitled to their own perspective, right? Their own view of reality. It's when they force that view of reality onto another person, that's the point.
Right. Well, and I also think that it if you and I are just having a conversation, and then later you remember something that we said slightly different than I did, that's maybe just a difference of memory. But when it becomes a,
Mm-hmm.
a repeated pattern of behavior, that's when it become that's when you can define it more as
Mm-hmm.
gaslighting. And I think actually that's where the overt gaslighting is in some ways a lot more obvious. When you see it, it's like, oh, that's what it is. But with the much more kind of subtle
Mm-hmm.
covert gaslighting, it maybe might take a lot longer to really recognize that that's what's happening. But I think whether or not it's intentional or not, or malicious or not, I think the effect on the victim of the gaslighting um, is it is the same, or can be the same.
Mm-hmm.
I think it still causes psychological distress and sort of this constant questioning of what is my reality? Did I actually remember that wrong?
Mm-hmm.
Am I crazy? What's going on? And
Yeah.
I think that so we're talking about maybe the differences between different types of narcissism, but I think it's also important to recognize that the effect on the victim is
Yeah.
still profound either way.
Oh yeah, yeah, total questioning of even how they, so it's not just questioning memory, it's questioning how they think and what they like and who they are and what their own personality is because they're being told, even in subtle ways, You don't really think that, do you? Like it's
Right,
stupid to think that, or no, you don't like that, we'll go somewhere else. Things like that where when you're constantly being told what you do like or don't like, what you do want to do, how you do think, and that kind of thing. It's just that constant unsettling of, wait, is there any substance to me that I can rely on to bring to the
right,
table?
right.
So I think the other thing I would love to know is when you're working with your clients, how do you help a woman, for example, who is feeling she's diagnosed it as gaslighting, feeling really gaslit? How do you help her navigate healing in that kind of context?
Oof, good question, big question. Um, I think so much of the attention um, has been on, especially for somebody who hasn't really received much um, therapeutic intervention or much care. Um, I think so much of her attention has been on, or so much of her effort has been on trying to prove that it's happening, and then trying to name it and provide examples of it,
Mm-hmm.
and I think it's this attempt to try to confirm that she's not crazy, and that these things are actually happening, that she is experiencing these things. And then I think sometimes there's also an attempt to try to prove it to the gaslighter, to say, this is what you're doing, can you please see what you're doing? Because um and it makes sense, they want it to stop, and so it's like
Mm-hmm.
you go to the source and you say, please stop this. But
Right.
oftentimes what they get in response is just more gaslighting. you know I'm not
Right.
doing that, you're crazy.
Yep.
So I think that the first stop is to just affirm that no, you're not crazy, and that is happening, and to address that attempt to say, you're attempting to try to prove that this is happening, and you actually don't need to. If you
Mm-hmm.
feel uncomfortable and you feel like you're not being, like your emotions and your needs are not being attended to or heard, that's enough. That's enough for you to know.
Yeah, and in a healthy relationship, when someone's feeling unsettled or unheard or whatever, it is a simple thing to go and say to the other person, hey, here's something you're doing that's not sitting well. Can we talk about doing something different, right? And in a healthy relationship, there is that willingness to step in and go, oh, didn't know I was hurting you. So let's talk about doing things different. So it's natural to go to the source first and say, hey, can we change something? But when you're dealing with an unhealthy relationship, it just constantly sets up that dynamic where now the person who's used to having power and control is seeing another foothold for more power and control, and it just cycles worse. So I do the same thing. I tell a lot of people that, at the end of the day, you don't have to prove why this bothers you. You don't have to prove what's really happening. You know it's happening. You know you don't like it. You know there's something that needs to be done with it. You've already gone to that person and tried to ask them to be different, and they're not. So it doesn't do any good to, beat them over the head over and over and over again, trying to get them to change. And so what does that leave you? That leaves you thinking about what you can do to be stronger, not listen to it. Like, manipulation is only manipulation when you give up your right to choose. Gaslighting, same thing. Gaslighting is only gaslighting when you give up your right for your own perspective, right? When you start questioning yourself, that's where the gaslighting has its effect. And so, in actuality, learning how to stand your own ground on what you know, what your experience and perspective is, working with where, like, growing and learning yourself so that you're not staying in an unhealthy place. But really, at the end of the day, you have greater strength in developing the skills and techniques to be, I've started calling it an undercover agent in a war zone, like
Oh,
skills and techniques and ability to move in the space that you're in, even if it is still a dangerous space, but having the ability to hold to your own sense of self in the middle of it.
I like that. Yeah.
So teaching those kinds of those self-awareness skills, and not that that makes the gaslighting stop, but it definitely makes it lose its power because you're not still engaging in the power struggle.
Right. I was actually going to comment about that, that you had said that earlier. I think the gaslighting still continues, but the effect of the gaslighting and the emotional impact that it has is
Yeah.
not as profound.
Yep.
I also think that identifying the needs of uh, that she might have emotional um, needs, and that identifying that she has those needs, but also in determining where else to go to fill those needs. And sometimes I think if it's been years or decades of this type of pattern of communication, I think that there has been a pretty significant, oftentimes, hit to self-esteem and confidence,
Mm-hmm.
and so working in that area to kind of replace that shaky ground.
Right.
Now,
Yep.
on the other end of things, talking about the narcissist or the gaslighter, especially for somebody who really does not recognize that that's what they're doing. Because there's I think there's a group of guys that they're causing pretty significant harm and they know it. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and but there's a lot of these guys that I work with that are more of the covert, and they really do not see what it is that you're talking about. How do you um, begin that work with them?
I usually try to get super, super practical. Like, if you do this, what is a natural consequence of that? When you stomp on someone's toe, every time you're around them, there's going to come a point where they're not going to want to be around you. So that's not really working for you. So getting that practical is looking at the behavior, even if they haven't made the connections, looking at the really just baseline. When you talk to people with that kind of tone or that kind of powering over what they're saying, and you don't make room for them, naturally they're going to be inclined to not make room for you. Is that really what you want in your life? And so, trying to boil it down to how do we actually build relationships, build connections in our life? Well, we can't build connections when we're doing things that are tearing down what we just built. And so, getting really practical and making the connection for them where they haven't had that insight to go, oh yeah, probably shouldn't treat my wife this way, because when I do, of course she's going to go off the rails,
Right, right,
rather than just getting upset at her for going off the rails in a very natural way, like anybody else would do that if you treated them that way.
right. Sometimes I will just avoid the gaslighting conversation altogether, as far as the um, let's name it and be specific and define
Mm,
it and all that, and just say, okay, let's put that aside, and um, just identify the fact that your partner does not feel like you are attending to their needs and emotions. So
mm-hmm.
how can you do you want to do that in a more effective, meaningful way? I guess that might be the first question. And then
Mm-hmm.
how do you do that? And I think that I talk a lot about trying to foster a sense of curiosity
Mm-hmm.
about your partner, and I think that that's a pretty foundational building block for empathy and intimacy. And I think that people really struggle with having curiosity about someone else when there are uncomfortable emotions present,
Mm-hmm.
especially ones that will trigger that type of defensive responses.
Yeah, especially too when they've had a lot of volatility in their relationship already. Like it can feel really a little too exposing, so to speak, to be curious because they're too self-protective in that moment. But yeah, when I'm working with a couple in a session and there's gaslighting happening in front of me, or one or the other is accusing, each other of gaslighting, I tell them, you have a right to your own perspective. We're not going to get anything done arguing over whose perspective is correct. What we have to figure out is what do we have left to work with to build something with. So what do you want? Where do you want to go? What does this need to look like for there to be healing? So they're thinking more in terms of what are our next steps? How do we build what's next? Otherwise, we can spend a lot of time arguing over whose whose story is the correct version of what happened or what brought them here, or whatever it is we're talking about in the context of a
Exactly.
session. When I
Exactly.
hear people trying to recall specific details about events that happened years ago, I'm always cautious about, like, how did they really remember those specific details? Although I know there's probably a lot of specific details they do, but we can't argue that point, because at the end of the day, it's not the specific details that are the most important. What's more important is the takeaway from those events. Um, so if you're in the middle of a fight or some sort of trauma, something that put you into fight or flight mode or that adrenaline rush, your memory formation is messed up anyway. So that's that other element of a
Right.
difference in, how we remember things. Two people looking at the same accident are going to remember very different details about it. It doesn't make either version incorrect. It just means that whatever got stuck in their memory is going to be different. And so
Right.
sometimes people can be very adamant about their memory of a situation and use that as gaslighting to control the other person. And then again, that's where I would say, okay, your version of your story is your story. It's your story to tell. However, what did we learn from that? Like, what was the message you took away from that traumatic event or that episode or whatever it is? What was the message you took away from that? And how can we find the truth so that we can mature and grow and learn from that thing, whatever happened, but also walk in truth in a way that it'll help you still build a relationship and make wise choices next and that kind of thing.
Right. You you mentioned, or you talked about how emotion plays a big factor in the coding and the recall of memory. And I think you also mentioned trauma, and so I think trauma also adds a big component to that on the coding of memory, and the interpretation of events. So we bring vulnerabilities into the present moment, and those could be patterns of communication that have been abusive or traumatic in the past. It also could be um, certain vulnerabilities, not even within the context of this relationship, but in previous relationships. So I think
Mm-hmm.
it definitely gets complicated quickly, and a lot of times I will work to at least explore some of those vulnerabilities that we're bringing into um, uh, or that clients are bringing into their communication with each other.
Yeah. Because really, like, all of us are going to be impacted by trauma. We're going to be impacted by our own faulty memory that's clouded by emotions, and our own personalities of how we tick, how we view the world, what kind of space we want to move in. Like, we're all susceptible to unhealth in every one of those areas. And being able to kind of get back to that place where you're like, well, who am I? Where am I going? What are my values? And that enables us to stand true to who we are, even in the face of other people who are a mess, and makes us better able to decide whether or not we can stay engaged with those other people. So it also leads into knowing how to put good boundaries into place too, which is a whole nother topic all on its own.
Next week on.
So yeah, next week on boundaries.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think again, I think the biggest thing is when we're working with clients, um, having an understanding of some of its definitions is good because it helps to make sense of stuff. But there comes a point where we've got to take the information and actually use it to build a direction. Where are we going? What are we doing with this? And not just looking for the gaslighter to stop gaslighting, for example, but it to be able to hold true to our own selves, even if they still gaslight, knowing that the relationship is going to be dependent on that gaslighter probably changing their tactics, but a person's sense of self doesn't have to be destroyed by that person not engaging in a healthy way.
Yes.
So